Throughout history, we have been faced with plagues and all in all misfortune with disease. But especially nowadays, we understand what our ancestors went through. But even with our new technologies and understanding of health, we still debate on the use of foreign treatments to help us. But even with the eventual diplomacy that we get through these debates, as historians say, history repeats itself. But especially in the case of the United States, inoculation has always been a hot debate topic. But to show just how much of a hot debate topic, let's bring it back to the past with our old friend smallpox. Smallpox, an acute contagious viral disease, with fever and pustules usually leaving permanent scars. During the early 14th century, smallpox, an infectious and brutal disease, was first discovered in China. The disease included a terrible case of symptoms that included headache, backache, fever, chills, and harsh vomiting. But even through all of that, there were still more symptoms, such as rash, which would turn into sores that appeared in the patient's mouth and nasal pathways. These sores would eventually spread all over the skin. The sores in time would crack, open, and ooze, and then 10 days after the oozing occurred, the scabbing would start taking place until the patient would eventually die. This process would take about a full month to complete, having a 30% mortality rate for the variola major and a 1% mortality rate for the variola minor. Donald R. Hopkins, historian researcher, puts this process in words best, saying, "The suddenness and unpredictability of its attack, the grotesque torture of its victims, the brutality of its lethal or disfiguring outcome, and the terror that it inspired." Smallpox in Washington's army. The disease would then spread all over the world, becoming one of the most well-known diseases all the way up to 1979, when an official vaccine was created. But before the vaccine process, a different process to protect people from the disease was also created. This process was called Verilation, which is defined as an obsolete method of immunizing patients against smallpox by infecting them with a substance from the pustules of patients with a mild form of the disease, in this case, variola minor. But before this method was created, the Chinese had created the first attempt at smallpox inoculation, which entitled basically snorting scab from an infected person. This, like variolation, would give you the sickness, but in a less harmful state that would give immunity after it had passed. This method would also not involve getting the scarring that all patients who had contracted the virus naturally would get if they survived. But the later perfected version of this would be variolation, which was getting scabs from an infected patient and cutting open a vein and stuffing as much as they could onto the opening and then wrapping it up to stop the bleeding. This, like the old process, was very unclean, but still a way to become immune to the virus. This operation was mostly done in Europe and different African nations. This operation was introduced to the British by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, writer and the wife of the Turkish ambassador Edward Wortley Montagu. This brings us back to what will soon be the United States, specifically Boston 1721. Boston at this point in time is facing a huge problem with smallpox because everybody in the new colonies has no built immunity against the virus. Reverend Cotton Mather, who lived in Boston during the time, had just found out about his new process of inoculating yourself from smallpox, called variolation, from his slave Onesimus, who had gotten virilized while he lived in West Africa. Mather had decided to try out the procedure with promising results. But even with the results, the rest of the colonists were still against this procedure, specifically for two reasons. One being that Puritan was their main religion during the time, which made them believe that God wanted them to get smallpox, and two being that variolation was seen somewhat as a heathen process, since it was mostly seen conducted by Native Americans and Africans. Mather did find some people who would take the procedure, and he could see that there was only a 2% fatality rate to his inoculation versus the 14% fatality rate during the Boston outbreak in 1721 without inoculation. But even with these results, colonies still banned the practice or refused to partake in it. People were so mad at Mather that one man threw a bomb through his window with a note attached to it saying, "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you, I'll inoculate you with this, with a pox to you." Later in the century, specifically 1775, the American Revolution would take off. In July of 1775, British soldiers were stationed in Boston to oversee the people. This, however, was very bad for the revolutionaries, mostly because the British had sent over men who had been fighting smallpox while they were in England, so they were immune but still carrying the antibodies of the virus. George Washington during this time had to make a hard decision: inoculate his troops and face backlash from other colonies, along with trying to set up a time to try and keep everybody in quarantine while they go through the disease, or not inoculate his troops and try his best to fight two wars, one against health and the other against men. George Washington opted instead not to get his troops virilized, which in hindsight is an interesting choice considering George Washington once caught the disease when he was 19. George's plan was to keep the British and smallpox as best as he could confined in Boston. Luckily for him, it worked, and by March of 1775, he would take over Boston with 1,000 troops who had already either been inoculated or had the virus previously. Even though George had won this battle, most of the troops were still very susceptible to the virus, which would later make things very hard for his plan in Canada. The revolutionaries assumed that the British would try to come to the States through the north, so men were stationed out there as a precaution in August of 1775, but their plans were quickly soiled due to smallpox. Most of the men stationed in Canada had smallpox, which caused people to want to get illegally virilized, but during the process would still be contagious due to the incubation period, which would make it spreadable to other men. But because there were more people getting smallpox, people wanted to get virilized to not catch the disease. All in all, creating a horrible loop for everybody involved. The revolutionaries kept getting complaints about the situation, so they sent General John Thomas to command and fix what was happening. The general was not only an idealized major, but a doctor as well. The officials urged the general to get inoculated, but he refused. The day before he had shown up, inoculation was unbanned by the then commander, Benedict Arnold. But when the general showed up, he rebanned the practice. Thomas would only be alive half a month before he himself died, ironically, by smallpox. Finally, smallpox had become too prevalent to ignore at this point. Smallpox had started to affect recruitment into the army, with men fearing getting the disease, and those who had already joined were now deserting because of the terrible conditions. George Washington finally came to his senses and realized that they weren't going to win this war if they didn't defeat smallpox first. He would then send a letter to Congress in 1777 saying that he was going to inoculate all the troops, even setting up a plan to inoculate people as soon as they signed up in Philadelphia. Though his strategy took a while, it eventually paid off. In 1778, 36% of soldiers were listed as ill, but by May 1781, there were no real cases of smallpox within the troops anymore. And in case you haven't noticed, because of their decision, we now live in what we now know as the United States of America.